Why contact on here? You can't park that here. This is private property. Sorry, I didn't know. I'll move it right away. It's the right thing. Arrest him. He's trying to steal the car. This is outrageous. You can't just stand there and do nothing. Sir, please, let's all calm down and discuss this rationally.
He pulled into his own driveway. Quiet neighborhood. Luxury home. A Rolls-Royce shining under the lights. Then sirens exploded. A jealous neighbor pointed and said, "That black man is stealing that car." Hands went up. Cameras rolled. Police surrounded him in his own home. What the neighbor didn't know, he wasn't stopping a crime. He was about to expose himself to the world. Stay till the end. Because when the truth comes out, regret hits harder than handcuffs. Would you stay calm in this situation? Comment yes or a no. Subscribe now. This story flips fast, and the ending is unforgettable. The Rolls-Royce ghost glided to the iron gates of Ashwood Heights, like a whisper wrapped in chrome. Elijah Cook loosened his tie as the car rolled along the curved private road. Headlights tracing the manicured hedges that framed the neighborhood like a living museum. The day had been long. 3 meetings back-to-back, a delayed flight, a tense call with overseas partners arguing over fuel routes and shipping lanes. The kind of day that made even billionaires crave nothing more than silence. Ashwood Heights always delivered that. The homes were architectural statements, glass, stone, steel, each separated by generous stretches of greenery. No loud music. No children riding bikes after sunset. No chaos. Just order, precision, control. Elijah appreciated it for exactly that reason. He pulled into his driveway, the automatic lights illuminating the smooth concrete and the minimalist facade of his home. The engine purred to a stop. For a moment, he stayed seated, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, breathing out the weight of the day. That was when Dominic Howard noticed him. From behind the sheer curtains of the house across the street, Dominic's eyes narrowed. He had been standing there longer than he cared to admit, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, watching the quiet street like a sentry guarding invisible borders. The Rolls-Royce had become a recurring presence, too recurring for Dominic's liking. He watched Elijah open the car door with unhurried precision. No driver, no entourage. Just a man himself, stepping out in a tailored navy suit, cufflinks catching the light, posture straight but relaxed. Dominic's jaw tightened. He doesn't fit, Dominic thought. Not here, not among the old families. The inheritances. The men whose fathers' names were engraved on plaques at the country club. Dominic had lived in Ashwood Heights for 22 years. He knew who belonged. He knew which cars matched which driveways. And that man across the street, no matter how expensive his suit was, didn't feel right. Elijah shut the car door softly and reached into the back seat for his briefcase. That's when the street erupted in red and blue. The sudden wash of flashing lights fractured the calm like shattered glass. The silence Elijah cherished evaporated instantly, replaced by the low growl of engines and the crackle of police radios. Elijah froze. 2 patrol cars pulled in sharply behind the Rolls-Royce, blocking the driveway. Another slowed at the curb. Doors opened almost in unison. Elijah's instincts kicked in, not panic, but awareness. He raised his hand slowly, briefcase dangling from his fingers, and turned his body slightly so he could see what was happening without making sudden movements. Officers stepped out, boots hitting pavement with heavy certainty. Their hands hovered near their holsters. Not drawn, but close enough to make the message unmistakable. Dominic burst out his front door. "This is him," he shouted, voice sharp, almost triumphant. He pointed across the street, fingers slicing the air. "That's the man I told you about. He's stealing that car." The word stealing echoed louder than the sirens. Elijah felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from recognition. A moment he had navigated too many times in boardrooms and private lounges, in airports and gated spaces. The moment when assumptions formed faster than facts. An officer raised a hand toward Elijah. "Sir, don't move." Elijah nodded once. "I'm not moving." His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle. Dominic stormed closer, emboldened by the attention. "I've lived here for decades," he insisted, looking from officer to officer. I know every homeowner. That car doesn't belong here. He doesn't live here. Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting Dominic's gaze for the first time. There was no anger in his eyes, no challenge, just a steady, assessing calm that unsettled Dominic more than rage ever could. This is my residence, Elijah said evenly, and that is my vehicle. Dominic scoffed. Yeah? Then why have I never seen you at any HOA meetings? Why don't you socialize with the rest of us? Because I mind my business, Elijah thought, but didn't say. Instead, he kept his hands visible, palms open. The officers exchanged brief looks. One of them, a younger cop, shifted his stance, eyes flicking between Elijah's suit, the Rolls-Royce emblem, and Dominic's agitation. Sir, the officer said to Dominic, you're the one who called this in? Yes, Dominic replied instantly. I told dispatch there was a suspicious black man attempting to steal a luxury vehicle. The word black landed heavily in the air. Elijah felt it, not like a blow, but like a line drawn across the pavement. An invisible boundary suddenly made very visible. A neighbor's porch light flicked on. Curtains moved. Phones began to rise, lenses peeking from behind hedges and door frames. Ashwood Heights was watching now. Sir, another officer said cautiously, turning to Elijah, can you provide identification and proof of ownership? Of course, Elijah replied. He moved slowly, deliberately narrating his actions as he reached into his inner jacket pocket. My wallet is inside my jacket. I'm going to take it out now. No one told him to do that. He did it because he knew the rules of moments like this. Dominic folded his arms, lips curling with satisfaction. This was exactly how it was supposed to go. Questions, doubt, authority leaning his way. Finally, he thought, someone's listening. Elijah handed over his ID, then calmly unlocked his phone and opened the vehicle registration app. The officers examined the documents. Names matched, address matched. Dominic's smile flickered, but he pressed on. People fake that stuff all the time, he snapped. You can't just trust. Sir, an officer interrupted, voice firmer now. Please step back. Dominic hesitated, then retreated a step, frustration leaking through his composure. Elijah stood silently as the officers conferred in hushed tones. His heart beat steadily, but his mind was already calculating consequences. Not for himself, but for how quickly a misunderstanding could become something else entirely. He glanced at his house. The front door stood just a few yards away. So close, and yet the distance felt enormous. A senior officer's vehicle pulled up at the edge of the cul-de-sac. The driver stepped out, a taller man with graying hair and an air of authority that immediately shifted the posture of everyone present. What do we have? The senior officer asked. One of the cops gestured toward Elijah. Possible vehicle theft, sir. The senior officer looked at Elijah, then at the Rolls-Royce, then down at the ID still in the younger officer's hand. His eyes paused, then narrowed. Say the name again, he said quietly. The officer read it aloud. Elijah Cook. The senior officer's expression changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. His shoulders relaxed. His stance softened. He looked back at Elijah, recognition dawning. Dominic saw it, and for the first time since he'd picked up the phone, a thread of unease crept into his confidence. The senior officer stepped closer to Elijah. Before he could speak, one of the officers raised a hand and said carefully, Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle. Slowly. The night held its breath. Elijah met the officer's eyes, searching for something. Hostility, uncertainty, intent. He nodded once. All right, he said calmly. He took one slow step back. Then another. The flashing lights reflected off the polished chrome of the Rolls-Royce, painting the scene in red and blue, power, suspicion, and silence colliding in a single driveway. And the neighborhood watched. If this were you, would you stay calm or panic? Comment below. Subscribe now. This story escalates fast. The red and blue lights continue to pulse against the walls of Ashwood Heights. But inside Elijah Cook's mind, the noise had already faded. He stood beside his Rolls-Royce with his hands still visible, posture steady, breathing slow. The officer spoke around him. Questions, confirmations, radio murmurs. But Elijah had learned long ago how to separate sound from meaning. What mattered wasn't what they were saying. It was why they were here. And he knew exactly why. Elijah's life had not begun in places like this. He grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a closed-down tailor shop on the south side of the city. The kind of place where pipes knocked through winter nights and ambition had to be louder than circumstance. His mother worked double shifts as a hospital administrator. His father drove delivery trucks until his back gave out. There were no shortcuts, no safety nets. By 14, Elijah was fixing neighbors' computers for cash. By 16, he was teaching himself supply chain logistics from borrowed textbooks and late-night forums. He learned discipline before comfort, silence before applause, strategy before emotion. When his first company failed, he didn't announce it. He studied why. When his second company succeeded, he didn't celebrate publicly. He reinvested. That pattern never changed. Wealth came later, almost accidentally. Recognition came after that. But by then, Elijah had already decided who he was not going to become. He did not chase headlines. He did not perform success. He did not confuse visibility with power. That was why he drove himself. Why he attended neighborhood events rarely. Why he chose Ashwood Heights not for its prestige, but for its quiet. Unfortunately, quiet had never meant invisible. Across the driveway, Dominic Howard watched the scene unfold with a tightening knot in his chest. This was supposed to feel better. Dominic had imagined this moment differently. In his mind, the police would take control. The man would stammer. Papers wouldn't line up. Apologies would never come. Instead, Elijah stood calm, composed, almost untouched. Dominic hated that most of all. His own life had once felt solid, predictable, respected. He'd inherited his house, his position at a mid-tier investment firm, his place in the neighborhood hierarchy. Old money wasn't flashy, but it was secure. Or at least it used to be. Then the world shifted. Markets changed. Diversity initiatives arrived. Promotions went people who didn't look like Dominic, didn't come from his schools, didn't share his last name. His debts grew quietly at first. Credit cards, private loans, lifestyle expenses he refused to scale back. He told himself it was temporary, that things would rebalance. They never did. When Elijah moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago, Dominic felt it immediately. Not envy exactly, but displacement. A sense that something sacred had been breached. A black man, younger, richer, quieter, and worst of all, uninterested in approval. Elijah didn't ask questions, didn't overcompensate, didn't explain himself. To Dominic, that felt like disrespect. As the officers questioned Elijah again, Dominic's thoughts raced. This restores order, he told himself. This reminds everyone that rules still exist. He believed the call wasn't cruelty, it was correction. One of the officers asked Elijah about his schedule, where he'd been earlier, why he returned at that hour. Elijah answered without hesitation, without irritation. Inside, though, he felt the familiar calculation. Stay still. Stay calm. Don't give emotion room to misinterpret. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in his 20s, back when a raised voice in a boardroom cost him a partnership deal. Back when anger, however justified, became the excuse others needed to doubt him. So he stood still now. Dominic mistook that stillness for submission. He stepped closer, voice rising. You see? He's avoiding eye contact. That's suspicious. Elijah looked directly at him then, not confrontational, just present. I'm listening, Elijah said quietly. The simplicity of it unnerved Dominic. He felt suddenly exposed, like his own words were louder than he intended. Like the neighbors watching could see past his certainty and into something brittle underneath. The officers asked Dominic to step back again. He obeyed, but resentment surged hotter. This was supposed to be my moment, he thought. This was supposed to remind him, and everyone who runs things here. Elijah's phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He ignored it. A different sound caught his attention instead. A faint electronic click. He glanced toward the nearest patrol car. On the dashboard-mounted camera, a small red light blinked to life. Recording. Elijah noticed it immediately. Cameras had shaped his adult life. Conference recordings, interviews, compliance, audits. He understood their power. Truth multiplied when it was documented. Dominic noticed too. But where Elijah felt grounding, Dominic felt panic. A recorded moment could not be controlled, could not be rewritten later. The officer nearest the patrol car adjusted the angle slightly, ensuring both Elijah and Dominic were clearly in frame. "Sir," the officer said to Dominic, voice neutral but firm, "please remain where you are." Dominic swallowed. Suddenly, his thoughts raced in a different direction. What if this doesn't go the way I planned? What if people misinterpret? What if they think I overreacted? Fear crept in, not of punishment, but of exposure. Elijah felt it too, but differently. He sensed the moment tightening, like a string drawn too far back. He knew that once certain lines were crossed, outcomes became inevitable. Still, he refused to fill the silence with defensiveness. He waited. The senior officer returned, holding Elijah's ID. His tone shifted, quieter now, more respectful. "Mr. Cook," he said, "thank you for your patience." Dominic's head snapped up. The use of Elijah's last name landed hard. Not sir, not suspect name. Dominic felt something slip, subtle but irreversible. Elijah inclined his head slightly. "Of course." The officer glanced at the camera, then at Dominic, and then back at Elijah. The red light continued blinking. The neighborhood continued watching. And both men understood, though for very different reasons, that this moment would not end here. Who do you think is really afraid here, Elijah or Dominic? Like if you already sense what's coming. The first thing no one noticed was the sound, not the police radios, not the murmurs from the neighbors, but the quiet click of a dispatcher replaying audio inside a county communications room miles away. Because every 911 call lived twice. Once in the moment it was made, and again when someone decided to listen closely. Dominic Howard's voice came through the speakers, clear, confident, unshaken. "There's a suspicious individual," he had said. "A black male, mid-30s. He's attempting to steal a Rolls-Royce. No, I don't believe it's his. He doesn't live here." The dispatcher had asked routine follow-ups. Dominic's responses hadn't wavered. "He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. These kinds of cars don't just end up here. I'm just trying to protect property values. No shouting, no panic, just certainty." Back in Ashwood Heights, that certainty was unraveling frame by frame. Balcony doors slid open. Curtains shifted. Phones appeared. At first, neighbors filmed discreetly, pretending to check messages, holding devices low. Then the tension drew them closer. A woman across the street stepped fully onto her porch, camera raised openly. A teenager leaned out a second-story window, whispering to someone off-screen, live streaming. Evidence multiplied quietly. Elijah Cook stood beside his Rolls-Royce Ghost, as if time had slowed around him. The car gleamed under the flashing lights. Polished chrome, flawless paint, unmistakably owned. The license plate was registered to his name. The insurance documents were current. The address matched the house directly behind him. He handed everything over without a word of complaint. One officer reviewed the paperwork, then looked at the house, then back at Elijah. Another officer checked the VIN, running it twice. No alerts, no flags, no inconsistencies. Something was off, but not in the way Dominic expected. The officers began to hesitate. Not enough to disengage. Not yet, but enough to recalibrate. This wasn't the usual scenario. Elijah wasn't agitated. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't reaching for explanations or permission. He answered questions precisely, succinctly. "Yes, this is my residence. Yes, I arrived 10 minutes ago. Yes, the vehicle is registered in my name." His voice never rose. His hands never moved unless asked. The calm unsettled Dominic. He stepped forward again. "Look, I don't understand why we're still debating this. I made the call. I know what I saw." One of the officers turned toward him slowly. "Sir, please step back." Dominic bristled. I'm the one who called this in. And we're handling it, the officer replied. Dominic's confidence flickered. Across the street, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. He's got paperwork. Another voice followed. Why would he steal his own car? Dominic shot them a look, but the murmurs didn't stop. Inside one of the patrol cars, the bodycam footage continued to record Elijah's composure, Dominic's agitation, the growing crowd, the documents changing hands. Inside the communication center, a supervisor leaned closer to the audio replay. She paused the recording, rewound, listened again. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She tagged the call for review. Back outside, one officer spoke into his radio, voice lower now. Dispatch! Can you confirm the caller's statements? Any prior incidents tied to this address? The reply crackled back. Neutral. Careful. Stand by. Time stretched. Elijah felt it. The moment suspended between danger and resolution. He'd been here before in different forms. Boardrooms. Border crossings. High-stakes negotiations where one wrong word could tilt outcomes permanently. The principle was always the same. Let the facts speak. Don't interrupt them. Dominic didn't know how to do that. Why are you all acting like this is normal? He snapped. People like him don't just... He stopped himself too late. Too many phones were pointed his way now. An officer glanced sharply at him. Sir, that's enough. The word sir landed differently this time. Not deferential, corrective. Dominic's throat tightened. He suddenly became aware of how he looked. Pointing, flushed, pacing. The narrative he thought he controlled was slipping into other hands. Elijah remained still. One of the officers returned with a tablet, eyes scanning the screen. His jaw tightened slightly, not with suspicion, but with recognition. He looked up, then back down again. Then he turned to his partner and said quietly, "This isn't what was reported as." That sentence, soft, almost casual, shifted the air. Dominic heard it. So, did the neighbors... So, what now? Someone whispered. The radio crackled again. Unit 12 dispatch said, "A supervisor's en route." Dominic's stomach dropped. Supervisors didn't come for routine misunderstandings. They came when something mattered. Inside the communications center, the supervisor replayed the 911 call once more, this time with a notepad open. She underlined phrases. Not illegal ones. Indicative ones. Back in Ashwood Heights, a black SUV pulled up silently behind the patrol cars. A senior officer stepped out. He surveyed the scene quickly. Crowd, cameras, officers, Elijah. Then he approached. "Who's the homeowner?" he asked. Elijah stepped forward slightly. "I am." The senior officer nodded, then glanced at the paperwork already in hand. He looked at Elijah again, this time more closely, not suspiciously, recognizing. A flicker across his face. He lowered his voice. "Did you say Elijah Cook?" The name landed like a drop glass. Dominic froze. The neighbors leaned in. The body cams captured everything. Elijah met the officer's eyes calmly. "Yes," he said. "That's my name." Silence followed. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of meaning. Somewhere, a dispatcher stopped the replay. Somewhere else, a notification was sent. And in the driveway of Ashwood Heights, everyone understood, though not yet fully, that the call Dominic made to feel powerful had just become something else entirely. A record. Should Dominic be worried right now? Yes or no? Don't miss the reversal. Subscribed. The shift did not announce itself with sirens or shouting. It happened in silence. The senior officer stood there for a long second after Elijah said his name, not staring, not doubting, processing. "Elijah Cook," he repeated, quieter now. The name moved through the space like a current. One officer straightened unconsciously. Another lowered his hand from his holster. A third took a step back without realizing why. The senior officer glanced at the tablet again, then at the house behind Elijah. Clean lines, discreet security cameras, understated wealth. No excess, no spectacle. Then he looked directly at Elijah. "Sir," he said, and the word carried weight this time. Can you give me a moment? Elijah nodded once. That was all. The senior officer turned away and walked a few steps toward the other officers. He spoke low, but not low enough. That's him, he said. Cook Global. Logistics and energy tech. You've seen the briefings. One officer's eyes widened. That Cook. The senior officer nodded. Major infrastructure partner. Donor. Cleared. This is his residence. The sentence landed with finality. Behind them, Dominic heard fragments. Not enough context. Just enough to feel something slipping beyond his reach. What are they saying? He muttered to himself. The officer who had first approached Elijah turned back toward him, posture visibly altered. Mr. Cook, he said carefully, I apologize for the inconvenience. We're just going to verify a few final details, but you're not being detained. The word detained echoed. 5 minutes earlier, Elijah had been ordered to step away from his own vehicle. Now the tone was entirely different. Another officer spoke up. Sir, you're free to remain by your vehicle if you like. Free. Dominic stared. That's it, he blurted out. You're just letting him stand there? The senior officer turned to face him fully for the first time. Mr. Howard, he said, reading the name from the call log. We need you to step back. Dominic scoffed. I made the call. And we responded. The officer replied evenly. Now we're resolving it. Dominic opened his mouth, then closed it. He felt the eyes. Neighbors. Officers. Cameras. The power he had felt when he dialed 911, the certainty, the control, was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Exposure. The senior officer turned back to Elijah. Mr. Cook, he said, on behalf of the department, I apologize for how this interaction began. A pause. Your documentation checks out. You're cleared. Cleared. The word carried a finality Dominic could not undo. One of the officers quietly returned Elijah's ID and registration, holding them with 2 hands now. Respectful. Measured. I'm sorry for the trouble, sir, he said. Elijah accepted the documents without expression. Not triumphant. Not smug. Simply present. He nodded once. Thank you. That was it. No speech. No accusation. No demand for consequences. And somehow, that restraint made the moment heavier. Dominic felt it. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how small his voice sounded in the open air. This isn't right, he muttered. I was just being cautious. The senior officer looked at him again. Sir, he said, we'll be following up regarding the call. Dominic's throat tightened. Following up how? That depends, the officer replied calmly, on what the review finds. Review. Dominic glanced around. Phones were still raised. Someone across the street whispered, Did you hear that apology? Another voice replied, Yeah, they know who he is. The implication burned. Dominic took a step back. He hadn't expected this. He'd expected validation, gratitude, reinforcement. Instead, the world had corrected him. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. The senior officer gave a small nod to Elijah. Again, sir, we apologize. Then he turned and addressed his team. We're done here. One by one, officers stepped away from Elijah's car. The semicircle dissolved. The flashing lights remained, but they no longer pointed inward. They pointed away. Dominic stood frozen on the edge of the driveway. The space between him and Elijah suddenly vast. Elijah glanced at him for the first time since the reversal, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just a look of calm acknowledgement, as if to say this didn't have to happen. Dominic felt his face flush. He leaned forward slightly, voice low, bitter. This isn't over, he muttered. Elijah said nothing. The senior officer heard it, though. He turned his head slightly. Sir, he said to Dominic, that's enough. The cameras caught everything. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. And in that silence, one truth became undeniable. The power Dominic thought he wielded had never belonged to him. Have you ever seen power shift this fast? Like if this moment gave you chills. The driveway went quiet that night, but the internet did not. By morning, the story was everywhere. The first video appeared at 6:42 a.m., grainy, shaky, filmed from across the street. It showed flashing police lights, a black man standing calmly beside a Rolls-Royce, and a white neighbor pointing, shouting, insisting something was wrong. By 7:10 a.m., a second clip surfaced, clearer this time. Bodycam footage, leaked just enough to show the moment the officer said Elijah's name, and the instant everything changed. By 8 a.m., the caption had already written itself. They called the cops on him for stealing his own Rolls-Royce. And the internet did what it always does when truth meets evidence. It detonated. Hashtags began trending before Elijah finished his morning coffee. Hashtag driving while black, hashtag Ashwood Heights, hashtag Rolls-Royce incident, hashtag Elijah Cook. People slowed the footage frame by frame. They analyzed tone, body language, the precise second when authorities shifted, when suspicion turned into apology. Comment sections filled with rage, disbelief, and recognition. This could have gone so wrong. They almost killed him. Look how calm he stayed. Why does this keep happening? By noon, national outlets picked it up. Local business titan wrongfully stopped a home neighbor's 911 call sparks outer-jet filing incident in Ashwood Heights under review. By evening, it was no longer local. International news platforms ran the clip with subtitles. A man in his own driveway to a car he legally owned, the call made with certainty and undone by facts. And in every version of the story, one detail stood out. Elijah Cook said nothing. Reporters called nonstop. His assistant logged over 200 missed calls in one afternoon. Networks wanted exclusives. Commentators wanted reactions. Influencers wanted him to speak his truth. Elijah declined all of it. No interviews, no statements, no social media posts. The silence unsettled people. In an age where outrage demanded instant commentary, Elijah offered restraint, and that restraint became its own kind of authority. The narrative didn't need his voice. The footage spoke clearly enough. Dominic Howard woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed before sunrise. Notifications stacked so fast they blurred into a single vibration. Messages from unknown numbers. Missed calls. Emails marked urgent. He opened one notification and felt his stomach drop. His name was trending. Someone had already identified him from the footage, linked his face to property records, cross-referenced HOA documents, posted screenshots. A comment with thousands of likes read, "Meet Dominic Howard." He called the cops. His social media accounts flooded instantly. Why did you think he didn't belong? You almost got someone killed. Say it. Why did you call? Dominic tried to post a clarification. It backfired. I was just being cautious, he wrote. Anyone would have done the same. The response was brutal. Screenshots of footage followed his comment everywhere it appeared. People replayed his pointing finger, his certainty, his refusal to listen. The internet did not debate. It judged. By the second day, journalists arrived at Ashwood Heights. Satellite vans lined the street outside the once quiet gates. Neighbors who had never spoken on camera before suddenly found their voices. He's lived here for years, one resident said of Elijah. Never caused trouble. Another hesitated, then added, Dominic, he complains a lot. A third spoke more carefully. This wasn't the first time he's called the police. That sentence changed everything. A reporter paused. What do you mean? The neighbor glanced around, then lowered her voice. He's called before. On delivery drivers. On guests. On people who didn't look like they belonged. The reporter's eyes sharpened. Patterns mattered. A newsroom miles away began digging. They pulled public records. Police logs. Dispatch calls tied to Dominic's address. What they found wasn't explosive at first. Just dates. Times. Descriptions. But when lined up, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 5 calls in 3 years. Each one reporting suspicious activity. Each one involving a black individual. Each one resulting in no crime. The reporter leaned back in his chair. This isn't caution, he said quietly. This is behavior. The headline changed tone. Man who called cops on Billionaire has history of false reports. The article went live at midnight. By morning, Dominic's name meant something very different. Elijah watched none of it. He went to work. Meetings, calls, decisions. From the outside, it looked like indifference, but those close to him knew better. Elijah understood something most people didn't. The moment you speak, the story becomes about you. By staying silent, he allowed it to stay about the truth, and the truth, once released, did not need assistance. Dominic's employer released a statement by day 3. "We are aware of the incident involving Mr. Howard." It read, "An internal review is underway." That sentence alone sent Dominic's anxiety spiraling. Colleagues stopped answering his messages. A supervisor requested a meeting, then postponed it. Friends distanced themselves publicly. Even neighbors who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact. The community that had once validated him now stepped away. The silence felt louder than condemnation. Meanwhile, the footage continued to spread. Influencers stitched it into commentary videos. Law professors broke down the legality of false 911 calls. Former officers weighed in, calling the situation dangerously close to tragedy. Each analysis circled back to the same point. If Elijah Cook had reacted differently, raised his voice, moved too fast, shown fear, the ending could have been irreversible. That realization haunted people. It haunted Dominic, too. He began to realize something terrifying. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had risked a life. Late that evening, a reporter sent an email to her editor. Subject, "There's more." She attached the document. Inside were transcripts of Dominic's previous calls. Language patterns, repeated phrases, the same certainty, the same assumption, the same need be believed. She typed one final line beneath the attachments. This wasn't an accident. This was practice. The editor replied with one word: "Run it." As the city slept, the next phase of the story prepared to break. And somewhere in Ashwood Heights, Dominic stared at his phone, refreshing a screen he could no longer control. Because once truth goes viral, it does not ask permission before changing lives. Should people face consequences for false 911 calls, share this story. Others need to see this. The story stopped being about one night the moment the numbers came out. 5 calls, 5 separate dates, spread across 3 years, 5 reports of suspicious persons, 5 black men, no arrest and no charges and no crimes. When an investigative piece dropped, the headline cut deeper than outrage ever could. Not a mistake, a pattern. The article didn't use inflammatory language. It didn't need to. It let the data speak. Screenshots of police logs filled the screen, each entry highlighted in yellow, each description eerily similar. Male subject doesn't appear to belong. Individual loitering near property. Suspicious behavior involving vehicle. None of the descriptions mention weapons. None mention threats. None mention actual crimes. Only discomfort. Only assumption. Only entitlement. The internet went quiet for a moment after that. Then it roared. Legal analysts weighed in immediately. This isn't about one bad call, one former prosecutor explained on a late-night panel. This is about weaponizing emergency services. A civil rights advocate put it more plainly. When you call the police on someone knowing they've done nothing wrong, you're introducing lethal risk into a situation that didn't require it. That sentence was shared millions of times. Because suddenly, this wasn't about embarrassment. It was about danger. The past didn't stop at police logs. Former co-workers began speaking out, one by one, carefully at first, then more boldly. A former colleague from Dominic's previous firm described him as obsessed with hierarchy. He used to say certain people needed to know their place, she recalled. He laughed it off as humor, but it wasn't funny. Another employee shared an internal email exchange. In it, Dominic complained about a changing culture and lowered standards. The dates aligned. The tone matched. The pattern grew clearer. Then came the money. An independent journalist noticed something odd while reviewing Dominic's professional history. Short tenures, abrupt exits, gaps explained away with vague references to consulting. A deeper dive uncovered financial discrepancies tied to one of Dominic's former employers, expense reports flagged, vendor relationships that didn't make sense, quiet settlements, nothing criminal yet, but enough to raise questions. Questions Dominic could no longer answer privately. Elijah watched the coverage unfold from a distance. He did not celebrate. He did not comment. But those close to him noticed a shift. "This is bigger than me," he said quietly to his legal advisor. "It always was." Elijah understood something essential. When systems are exposed, individuals become symbols, whether they want to or not. He had become one, not because he asked to, but because the truth demanded a face. Dominic, meanwhile, felt the ground disappear beneath him. The calls from journalists turned aggressive. Not curious, not polite, relentless. His employer placed him on administrative leave. Friends stopped texting. His wife asked questions he couldn't answer. "You said it was just one call," she told him. "Now they're saying 5. Dominic snapped back. "They're twisting everything." But even as he said it, he felt the weakness in his words. He had always relied on plausible deniability. Now there was data, documentation, a timeline, the one thing he could no longer outrun. The internet reframed him overnight, not as a villain, but as something more unsettling. Familiar, people recognize him. In stories their parents told, IN experiences they'd lived, IN moments where authority was used not to protect, but to exclude. Memes circulated, but so did essays. Long threads explaining how privilege works quietly, how entitlement doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers into a phone line and lets others do the violence. Dominic became the example, not because he was the worst, but because he was typical. Late one evening, a legal filing appeared on the public docket. Dominic Howard versus various media outlets. Defamation. The claim alleged that the reporting had destroyed his reputation and misrepresented his intentions. The filing went viral within minutes. Commentators didn't laugh. They sighed. "He's doing the thing," one legal analyst said. "He's trying to flip the narrative." Another was more blunt. "This is desperation." Elijah's legal team reviewed the filing. They said nothing publicly. But behind closed doors, one thing was clear. The fight had crossed a line. Once lawsuits are filed, stories stop being symbolic. They become legal. And legal battles leave paper trails no one can erase. Dominic believed the lawsuit would restore control, that the courts would slow the narrative. That procedure would protect him. He believed the system that had always been in his favor would do so again. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't see yet, was that the same documentation he once relied on was about to be turned against him. Every call, every email, every record. Discovery was coming. And discovery does not care about intent, only evidence. As the city buzzed with anticipation, one thing became certain. This was no longer about cancel culture. It was about consequence. And the system Dominic trusted was about to ask him the same question he once asked others. What proof do you have that you belong here? Is Dominic a victim of cancel culture or his own actions? Subscribe. This fight turns legal. Dominic Howard believed a lawsuit would save him. He believed that once lawyers were involved, the noise would quiet down, that timelines would stretch, that procedure would replace outrage, that truth, his version of it, could be negotiated. For most of his life, systems had worked that way for him. This time, they didn't. The defamation suit barely survived its first week. It began to unravel the moment discovery was requested. Dominic's legal team had framed the case around one claim, that the media had misrepresented an innocent act of caution and portrayed him as something he was not. But caution, it turned out, left fingerprints. The defense attorneys, representing multiple news outlets, submitted a single motion in response. Attached were documents. Police call logs, .911 audio transcripts, timestamp footage. Public statements Dominic himself had made online. Side by side, the contradictions were impossible to miss. In one interview, Dominic claimed he feared for his safety. In the audio recording, his voice was calm, confident, almost bored. In another statement, He said he didn't know who the man was. In the footage, he was heard insisting repeatedly that Elijah couldn't live here. The judge didn't need weeks. The ruling came swiftly. Case dismissed, not because the media was kind, but because the evidence was unforgiving. The dismissal hit Dominic harder than the headlines ever had. Within hours, legal commentators dissected the ruling publicly. This wasn't defamation, one analyst said. This was documentation. Another added, "You can't sue facts." The phrase stuck. Dominic's name trended again, but this time with a new label, the lawsuit that backfired. His employer moved next. The internal review that had once felt procedural now became decisive. Human Resources requested a formal interview. Dominic arrived defensive, exhausted, certain he could still explain his way out. But the panel didn't ask about the night of the incident. They asked about the pattern. Emails surfaced, complaints he had dismissed as misunderstandings. Performance reviews flagged with concerns he'd ignored. Expense discrepancies were quietly referenced. By the end of the meeting, Dominic knew. This wasn't a warning. It was an ending. He was suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation. His company-issued access badge was revoked on the spot. The security guard didn't meet his eyes as he handed it over. Friends disappeared in stages. At first, they checked in. Then they sent shorter messages. Then they stopped replying altogether. Invitations dried up. Group chats went silent. One longtime friend finally sent a message that stung more than insults ever could. "I can't defend this anymore." That was all. Dominic's spiral became public. He posted erratically online. Long paragraphs insisting he'd been misunderstood, followed by angry replies accusing others of betrayal. Screenshots spread. Commentators noted the shift. This is what loss of control looks like. One psychologist observed during a live stream. Not remorse. Panic. Dominic watched himself become a spectacle. The more he spoke, the worse it got. Every attempt to reclaim dignity stripped another layer away. And Elijah's life barely changed. He woke up early, went to work, met with partners, reviewed proposals. His company issued a brief statement, carefully worded and measured. "We trust the process and remain focused on our mission." That was it. No victory lap. No response to Dominic's accusations. No commentary on the lawsuit. The contrast was devastating. Where Dominic raged, Elijah remained still. Where Dominic demanded attention, Elijah withheld it. And somehow, that restraint became the loudest statement of all. Neighbors noticed. Elijah still waved politely during morning walks, still attended HOA functions quietly, still lived as he always had. Dominic, meanwhile, stopped leaving his house. Curtains drawn, car unmoved. When he did step outside, whispers followed. Not loud, just enough to be heard. Then the HOA email arrived. Subject line, "Emergency meeting, Ashwood Heights." The message cited recent events and community safety concerns. Mandatory attendance. Dominic stared at the screen. He knew what it meant. The same neighborhood he had tried to control was about to decide his place within it. And for the first time, he would not be the one making the call. Should neighborhoods have power like this? Like if accountability matters? The meeting room at Ashwood Heights had never been this full. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, faces tight with discomfort. The air carried a tension that felt heavier than any argument, because tonight wasn't about opinions. It was about decisions. The HOA board sat at the front beneath the polished crest of the community, a symbol meant to represent order, harmony, and shared values. Tonight, it felt more like a courtroom. Dominic Howard arrived late. When he walked in, the room reacted, not loudly, not dramatically. Conversation stopped. Chairs shifted. Eyes followed him in a way that made his shoulders tense. No one greeted him. No one smiled. He took a seat near the back, jaw clenched, hands gripping his phone like it might save him. Elijah Cook had arrived earlier. He sat near the aisle, not at the front, not in any position of prominence. He wore a simple dark jacket, posture relaxed, expression neutral. If someone didn't know the story, they might assume he was just another homeowner fulfilling an obligation. But everyone knew. The HOA president cleared her throat. "This emergency meeting is now in session," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the gravity of what was about to unfold. "Thank you all for attending on short notice." A pause. "This meeting concerns recent events that have brought national attention to Ashwood Heights." No one needed clarification. The board began with facts, not emotions, not accusations. Facts. A screen lit up at the front of the room. Video clips played, short, carefully selected segments. The police lights. Dominic pointing. Elijah standing still, hands visible. Then audio. Dominic's voice filled the room. "That car is stolen. He doesn't live here." The sound of it echoed differently indoors, stripped of context, stripped of adrenaline. It sounded smaller, meaner, unmistakable. The HOA president spoke again. "This footage has been reviewed by our legal counsel." She gestured to a man in a gray suit who stood briefly. "The actions depicted violate multiple community bylaws," he said, "including misuse of emergency services, conduct endangering residents, and behavior that threatens the safety and reputation of this neighborhood." Dominic shifted in his chair. His lawyer, who had advised him not to attend, was not there. The board continued. Police logs were summarized, not displayed in full, just enough. 5 calls, 0.5 instances, no crimes. A murmur rippled through the room. Some residents looked shocked. Others looked ashamed. A woman near the front covered her mouth. "I had no idea," she whispered. The HOA president raised a hand for silence. "We also consider the outcome of the defamation lawsuit," she said carefully, which was dismissed. That word, dismissed, landed hard. Dominic leaned forward. "This is unfair," he said suddenly. His voice cracked, louder than he intended. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood." The room stayed silent. No one responded. No one defended him. The HOA president looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of tired disappointment. "Mr. Howard," she said, "this meeting is not about your intentions. It's about your actions." She paused. "And their impact." The vote came sooner than Dominic expected. There were no dramatic speeches, no shouting, no grandstanding, just procedure. The president read the motion, based on the findings presented. The board recommends the immediate termination of Mr. Howard's membership in the Ashwood Heights Homeowners Association, effective immediately. A breath held collectively. All in favor? Hands rose, one by one, every single one. Not slowly, not hesitantly, unanimous. Dominic felt something inside him give way. He looked around, searching for a single dissenting hand. There were none. The president lowered her own hand last. "The motion passes," she said quietly. A finality settled over the room. Dominic opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. The consequences followed swiftly. "Effective immediately," the president continued. "Mr. Howard's access to community facilities and security systems is revoked." She glanced at a security representative standing near the door. "Please collect his access credentials." The guard stepped forward. Dominic stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," he said, his voice tight. "You're all overreacting." No one met his eyes. The guard waited patiently. Dominic hesitated, then handed over his key fob. The small plastic click echoed louder than it should have. Elijah stood, not because he was asked to speak, not because anyone expected him to. He simply rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the exit. A few people noticed. Some turned. Some looked away. The HOA president caught his eye. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might ask him to say something. Elijah shook his head gently. No words. No victory speech. No condemnation. He walked out quietly, leaving the room to sit with his decision. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The silence that followed was profound. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The footage slowed. Ashwood Heights returned to its carefully curated quiet. Then, one morning, residents noticed something. A sign, white, rectangular, unmissable, for sale. It stood on Dominic Howard's lawn. The house that once represented his control, his status, now advertised departure. No one said anything, but everyone noticed. Elijah drove past it one afternoon. The Rolls-Royce moved smoothly down the street. He didn't slow. He didn't look back. Some stories don't need an ending spoken aloud. Did the community do the right thing? Share your thoughts below. Dominic Howard left Ashwood Heights the way he had lived there. Quietly, without witnesses he could control. There was no moving truck parked out front for days. No farewell gathering. No dramatic exit meant to reclaim dignity. Just a slow, almost embarrassed disappearance. One morning, neighbors noticed the curtains were gone. A week later, the lights stopped coming on at night. Then one afternoon, a realtor's car pulled into the driveway, took photos, and left. By the end of the month, the house was empty. Dominic did not say goodbye to anyone. No one asked him to. The man who once believed he had authority over who belonged had become someone who no longer did. His social circle collapsed with brutal efficiency. Friends who once shared dinners, vacations, and private jokes stopped returning calls. Some blocked him outright. Others sent brief, apologetic messages. "This is too much for me right now." His former colleagues treated his name like a liability. Invitations dried up. Recommendations vanished. The professional network he once relied on dissolved under the weight of association. Even online, Dominic faded. The comments slowed. The mentions stopped. The outrage moved on to the next story. What remained was silence. And for Dominic, silence wasn't peace. It was exile. Elijah Cook stayed, not out of defiance, not to prove anything. He stayed because this was his home. Ashwood Heights continued to look the same on the surface. Manicured lawns, private security, evenings wrapped in quiet. But something underneath had shifted. People greeted Elijah differently now. Not with fear, not with suspicion, with recognition. Some offered nods that carried apology without words. Others stopped him during walks. "I just want to say, I'm glad you handled it the way you did. Thank you for not making this worse." Elijah listened. He accepted the words politely, but he didn't internalize them as praise. He understood something most people didn't articulate. The neighborhood wasn't thanking him for staying calm. They were thanking him for not forcing them to confront themselves publicly. His restraint had given them room to change without humiliation. Small changes followed. The HOA announced revisions to community guidelines, carefully worded, quietly implemented. Bias awareness training for security staff. Clearer protocols around emergency calls. New language about inclusivity and resident protection. No press release. No headlines. Just adjustments. The kind that matter long after attention fades. Parents spoke differently to their children. Not dramatically. Just enough. "You can't assume things," one mother was overheard saying. "Not based on how someone looks." Elijah noticed. He said nothing. The driveway where everything had begun became ordinary again. No cameras and no police lights, and no tension hanging in the air. Just a man returning home from work. Just a car pulling in. But Elijah knew something invisible lingered there. Memory. And memory, when unspoken, still teaches. One evening, weeks after Dominic's departure, Elijah returned home later than usual. He checked the mail absently, flipping through envelopes without much thought. Bills, community notices, advertisements. Then one envelope caught his attention. It wasn't official. No logo.no return address. Just his name written carefully in blue ink. He paused, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, clearly written by someone young. "Dear Mr. Cook, you don't know me, but I live a few streets over. MY Mom showed me the video. She said you stayed calm even when it was scary. I'm black, and sometimes I feel like people look at me like I don't belong. Seeing you made me feel like maybe I don't have to prove myself by being loud. Thank you for not getting angry. Thank you for staying. One day I want to be like you. Sincerely, a neighbor." Elijah sat down slowly, not because he was overwhelmed, but because this quiet moment carried more weight than everything that came before. He read the letter twice, then a third time. This was the part of the story no headline would ever capture. Power, Elijah knew, is often misunderstood. People think it looks like dominance, like winning, like someone else losing. But real power, the kind that lasts, looks like restraint, looks like dignity, looks like knowing when silence speaks louder than outrage ever could. Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it on his desk. Outside, Ashwood Heights rested in its usual calm. But somewhere nearby, a young person had learned something important, not from a speech, not from punishment, from example, and that, Elijah believed, was the only kind of legacy worth leaving. What would you have done in Elijah's place? Subscribe for stories that matter. Elijah Cook never told the story. Not at conferences, not in interviews, not over dinners where people leaned in, hoping for insight or outrage or something quotable. When the moment passed, he let it pass. That choice, more than anything else, defined what the story became. On a quiet Sunday morning, Elijah sat alone in his study. The house was still. No calls, no notifications, just sunlight resting on shelves filled with books he'd read slowly over years. He poured coffee, not rushing. Outside, the neighborhood breathed like it always had. Birds, sprinklers, distant traffic. Ordinary sounds. Familiar sounds. He thought about how close it all had come. Not dramatically. Not in the way movies portray danger. But in the quiet way reality works. Where a raised voice, a wrong movement, or a misunderstood moment can tip a situation past a point of return. The truth settled in gently, but firmly. This had never been about a Rolls-Royce. The car was just the excuse. Elijah had spent much of his life understanding systems. Markets, supply chains, infrastructure, risk. He knew how power moved, where it pooled, where it leaked, where it hid behind rules and tradition. What happened in that driveway wasn't new. It was familiar. The assumption that authority belonged to those who spoke first. The belief that confidence equaled correctness. The quiet expectation that some people must prove their belonging, while others never have to. Elijah didn't blame Dominic anymore. Not because Dominic deserved forgiveness, but because blame would give him too much importance. Dominic had been a symptom. The system was a story. Elijah stood and walked a window. Across the street, a child rode a bike slowly, wobbling, learning balance in real time. A parent followed at a careful distance, close enough to catch, far enough to let growth happen. That image stayed with him, because that was what had happened here. The system hadn't collapsed. It had been tested. And for once, because of documentation, witnesses, and restraint, it had held. No lawsuits followed. Elijah could have pursued them. Defamation, emotional distress, endangerment. Every legal avenue was open. He declined all of them, not out of mercy, out of clarity. The point had never been punishment. It had been truth, and truth had already done its work. Some people mistook his silence for passivity. They were wrong. Elijah understood that dignity was not the absence of response. It was a refusal to let reaction define you. Anger would have made the story smaller. Revenge would have made it about him. Silence allowed it to remain what it was, a lesson. Months passed. Ashwood Heights returned fully to routine. New families moved in. Landscapers trimmed hedges. At HOA meetings became dull again. That was a sign of real change. When accountability becomes boring, it means it's been absorbed. Elijah watched these changes without commentary. He noticed small things. Security guards who greeted residents differently. Neighbors who paused before making assumptions. Children who waved freely without fear of being watched too closely. Progress didn't announce itself. It rarely does. Elijah kept a letter from a young neighbor. Not framed. Not shared. Just folded neatly, tucked into a drawer beside other things that mattered. He took it out sometimes. Not to relive the moment, but to remember the responsibility. Because stories don't end when attention fades. They end when behavior changes. One evening, Elijah attended a small community event. Nothing formal, just a neighborhood gathering. Food trucks, music playing softly, laughter without tension. Someone asked him casually, "How did you stay so calm that night?" Elijah considered the question. Then he answered simply, "I knew the truth didn't need help." The person nodded, unsure they fully understood, but feeling the weight of it anyway. That was Elijah's legacy in Ashwood Heights. Not dominance, not victory. Proof. Proof that composure can be stronger than accusation. Proof that systems can be forced to work when light is applied. Proof that you don't have to shout to be heard if what you're standing on is solid. The story traveled far beyond the neighborhood. People shared it not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar, because too many had lived some version of it, and because it ended differently than they expected, not with a punchline, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with accountability. If there was a takeaway Elijah hoped people understood, it was this: power is not who speaks loudest. Belief is not who looks like they belong, and justice does not arrive by force. It arrives through proof, through witnesses, through restraint, through the quiet insistence that truth be recorded and allowed to stand. Elijah turned off the lights in his study and headed upstairs. Another day finished. Another life lived without spectacle. Outside, the street was calm. Inside, something permanent had shifted, not because a man was exposed, but because the system was forced to remember what it was supposed to do. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe. Truth only wins when it's shared.